The clinical variables affecting the implant prosthesis loading are: the first is the implant inclination. The second clinical variable is the cuspal inclination, and the third one is the horizontal offset, and the final one is the apical or the vertical offset. A comparative evaluation of the torque at the gold screw, abutment screw, and implant was calculated for these clinical variables. The method of comparison was expressed as a percentage of change from a hypothetical standard implant prosthesis configuration. These data facilitate rational clinical conclusions that cuspal inclination and the horizontal offset produce the most profound increase in the implant loading, while as the implant inclination and the vertical offset produce minimal torque. The evolution designed the teeth to handle any kind of the load due to presence of the periodontal ligament. This periodontal ligament enables the teeth to dissipate the load by permitting apicolateral movement, which acts as protective mechanism. Since the implants are rigidly fixed, any non-axial load becomes a problem. We must mimic natural long natural teeth as closely as possible. The research done by Weinberg and colleagues establishes a direct mathematical correlation between implant tilt and the torque acting upon the implant prosthesis. For every 10-degree increase in implant inclination, there is approximately 5% increase in the total load applied to the implant prosthesis system. This rule highlights that even minor deviations from the ideal vertical position significantly increase the mechanical demand on the hardware and the surrounding bone. As and when a load L is applied to the implant prosthesis, the resultant line of the force deviates from the center of rotation of the implant by a distance of d, as is indicated here. Hence, the torque acting upon the implant prosthesis is Fd. C. On changing the implant inclination related to the applied load by 10 degrees alters the working arm distance to capital D. The final torque acting upon the implant prosthesis increases to Fd. According to Weinberg, the final torque is more than the initial torque by 5%. Altering the implant body's orientation relative to the occlusal load changes the working arm, creating a lever effect that intensifies the resultant force. Think of it as a lever. The farther the force moves away from the center of rotation of the implant body, the more leverage is exerted against the bone implant interface. The axial load, as and when applied to implant prosthesis, passes along the length of the implant body, which is favorable for the long term success and clinical longevity of the implant. Upon changing the implant inclination relative to the applied load, by 10 degrees magnifies the overall load on the implant system. The non-axial load splits into the vertical and horizontal components. For a load of 100 pounds acting upon the implant prosthesis can be split into two components, the vertical and horizontal. The vertical component becomes 98.8 pounds, while as the horizontal component becomes 17.3 pounds. The total system load increases to 116 pounds. The math proves that the system is not just dealing with 100 newtons you applied. Because of the angle, the components add up to significantly higher total stress on the implant system. Let us plot implant inclination along the x-axis and the change in torque along the y-axis. The torque acting upon the implant prosthesis at some degree of the implant inclination is shown as a bar. The moment we increase the implant inclination by 10 degrees, the torque acting upon the implant prosthesis is increased by 5%. And the process repeats similarly if we keep altering the implant inclination. This is the rule of thumb to remember that a 10-degree implant inclination means 5% more load, and a 20 and 30-degree inclination increases 10% and 15% load respectively. Improving the implant inclination relative to occlusal load direction reduces the overloading and increases the clinical longevity. The treatment planning must prioritize axial orientation before implant insertion. Sometimes we have no choice. Anatomy wins. Anatomical limitations like lingual, mandibular, and nasal bone concavities, maxillary sinus lining, and the mental foramen inferior alveolar nerve approximating the ridge due to severe ridge resorption may force the surgeon to insert an implant at an inclination. But sometimes severe dilacerations or root curvatures may also force the surgeon to incline the implant to avoid the severe dilacerations. But one has to understand that an angled abutment corrects the emergence profile of the implant prosthesis and not the biomechanical torque at the bone implant interface. The moment arm remains altered, so we must document it and reduce the occlusal forces accordingly. The axial load is always favorable for the long-term success and the clinical longevity of the implant prosthesis. As and when the implant inclination is changed, the axial load becomes non-axial and clinical consequences pursue. The inclination is not just a theoretical number, it translates into the bone loss you see on the follow-up radiographs. Loose screws, which the implantologist have to retorque often, and eventually the implant failures. Respect the Weinberg's 5% rule, and your restorations will last longer.